A Chinese social media giant now owns a piece of Warner Music. The move comes after buying stakes in other industry giants like Universal and Spotify. But what are its ties with the communist regime back home? More details about the border clash between Indian and Chinese soldiers. An analyst says Beijing might be trying to create issues at the borders to shift Chinese people's focus from the domestic crisis. Chinese authorities say the situation in Beijing is still escalating. Over 350,000 people have been tested for the virus so far. Results are coming in. Severe floods continue to threaten China. Millions are impacted as rains drench 70% of the country's provinces. A local tells us what it's like. And a study warns the Chinese regime may try and use the economic fallout from the virus to expand its market share in the U.S. It's a strategy the regime used during the 2008 financial crisis. Welcome to China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. According to Chinese state-run media, over 350,000 people in Beijing have been tested for the CCP virus so far. More than 100 of them have tested positive. But these numbers cannot be independently verified, and the Chinese Communist Party has been known to grossly underreport virus cases. Images of Beijing citizens waiting to get tested have prompted concern of cross-infection. Chinese authorities say the situation is still escalating. About 60% of flights from Beijing have been canceled, most of them domestic. All neighborhoods in the city have been or will be put under lockdown. The tactic is part of what's called Warning Level 1, the highest alert in virus epidemic warning systems. Yet so far, China only announced Warning Level 2 for its capital city. One Beijing citizen who lives close to the Xingfadi market posted a call for help on social media. Xingfadi market is the source of the second outbreak cluster. He wrote that since last weekend, his neighborhood has been under overall lockdown. That means no one is allowed to leave the house to go shopping. In the beginning, residents could use an app to buy things online. But roads are now blocked and delivery vehicles can't enter the neighborhood. Residents are left with only one option: to help each other. No volunteers or official aid workers have brought food or other necessities to the neighborhood for 5 days. The Citizen Aid hotline is also not reachable. As a last resort, the netizens appeal to others online in an effort to get authorities' attention. One netizen commented that families should stockpile food and supplies in advance. They added that the regime's fake news harms people and expressed hope that through the pandemic, people will wake up to what's going on. Another netizen noted that Chinese state media has been extensively reporting about the protests and riots in the U.S. They wrote that ironically, the Chinese regime cares about the Black Lives Matter issue in the U.S. but has not time to take care of its own people. Severe floods are still drenching China and have been for weeks. 70% of the country's provinces and over 8 million people have been affected. Over 1.5 million acres of crops have also been hit. Along just one river in central China, 17 reservoirs have exceeded their maximum water levels. The flooding began in southern China, but now a new round of heavy rainfall is also soaking central China. A man from Guangxi province named Mr. Wu told us that in his area, a storm of this strength comes along once in 50 years. In order to protect his identity, we're using his last name only. He described how rain and darkened skies have persisted for 10 days, and adding that one of the storms even lasted for over 10 hours. Excessive rainfall, reservoir collapses, and flooding from the mountains stand as the three biggest dangers. Some dams also collapsed, while authorities opened the floodgates of others without notifying nearby residents. Mr. Wu said the same thing happened in his area. He explained that many of the area's younger people work in other towns, so when they're gone, only children and the elderly remain. That means that during the flooding, when some people went missing, no one was around to help search for them. As a result, the corpse of a local elderly person was found floating in the floodwater. This week, Chinese human rights lawyer Yu Wenshen was sentenced to 4 years in prison for inciting subversion of state power. 2 years ago, Yu published an article online titled "Recommendation for Constitutional Amendment." In it, he suggested holding an election to decide the president of the state, among other ideas. One day later, he was arrested. Yu's wife told us she hadn't been informed of her husband's court process. Instead, she received a phone call from the prosecutor's office after the proceedings to inform her of the result. She was also told that her husband wants to appeal to the court's decision. As early as 2014, Yu was detained for 99 days because of his support for democratic movements in Hong Kong. He was tortured while in custody. Following his release, he joined the China Human Rights Lawyers Group, where he represented many Falun Gong practitioners, prisoners of conscience, and other arrested human rights lawyers. Falun Gong is a spiritual meditation discipline that has been persecuted in China for over 20 years. Last month, Yu's wife published a video online asking the international community to demand that the Chinese regime immediately release her husband. In the video, she said she'll never give up. We have more details about the border clash between Indian and Chinese soldiers. Analysts say Beijing might be trying to create an enemy abroad to ease domestic pressure.
High-level military talks between India and China failed to break a standoff over a deadly border clash in the Himalaya mountains. At least 20 Indian soldiers are dead. Indian media reports it's the first loss of life in border clashes in at least 45 years. Under a note agreement between the two countries, no shots are to be fired at the border. An Indian official told the BBC there were 55 Indians against 300 Chinese. He said, quote, "They hit our boys on the head with metal batons wrapped in barbed wire. Our boys fought with bare hands." In a TV address to the nation, Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi said the soldiers' deaths will not be in vain.
I want to assure the nation that the sacrifice of our soldiers will not go to waste. For us, the integrity of India and sovereignty is at the top, and nobody can stop us from protecting them. Nobody should have an illusion or doubt in this matter.
The Chinese side has not released the number of deaths. Angry sentiments against China are high in India, and calls to boycott China-made products are erupting across the country. Tensions at the border went up in May when China surprised India by deploying troops to disputed areas. It's unclear why Beijing did it. But China affairs commentator Lan Shu told us it's a common tactic Beijing uses. It creates small border clashes when faced with domestic or international pressure, shifting focus away from the CCP's wrongdoings.
The India-China issue is a historical issue. The issue has already existed for a very long time. But why does it break out now? It is because when the Chinese Communist Party is in trouble, it needs to find an enemy from abroad so as to shift the focus from its domestic problems. Its main purpose is to transfer the focus of Chinese society.
Examples include China announcing war against Vietnam in 1979. At that time, the regime was in deep political and economic crisis after the Cultural Revolution. Beijing also ramped up anti-Japan propaganda in 2012 when current communist leader Xi Jinping was about to take power and internal party struggle was tense. Beijing is currently facing a potential second wave of the virus outbreak and a struggling economy.
The conflict may escalate, but whether it will indeed lead to a war, that depends on how deep the conflict is inside China, because the domestic conflict involves the stability of the communist rule. If the CCP cannot solve the domestic problem it is facing, it may create larger-scale conflicts. This is possible.
China is also stepping up its activity near Taiwan. On Wednesday, Chinese aircraft entered Taiwan's air defense identification zone for the fourth time in 9 days. Meanwhile, Japan reported that Chinese government ships have recently been seen moving near disputed islands in the East China Sea. Japan had protested to China and vowed to respond. Penny Zhou, NTD News.
House Republicans have issued a report on the origins of the pandemic. The 50-page interim report alleges the Chinese regime violated the World Health Organization's international health regulations in the outbreak's early days. It focuses on an analysis of the early days of the Chinese Communist Party virus, particularly the phase before the WHO declared a public health emergency of international concern on January 30th. The report notes that China never officially notified the WHO of the outbreak. It states, despite public reporting to the contrary, the PRC never notified the WHO about the outbreak in Wuhan. It says the CCP tried to limit information about the virus by covering it up. It also notes the silencing of whistleblower Dr. Li Wenliang. The report calls for an international investigation into the regime's cover-up and failure to slow the spread of the virus. It also raises questions about what role the WHO played in letting the Chinese regime delay information. The report points out that the WHO ignored early warnings of human-to-human transmission. It says WHO Director General Tedros responded to the CCP's cover-up by praising the regime for its transparency, adding that the organization repeatedly parroted CCP talking points while ignoring conflicting information. It also called Tedros's full-throated defense of the CCP's response and embrace of their revisionist history incredibly concerning. The report concludes that despite Chinese authorities' claims that they notified the WHO about the pandemic in a timely manner, the Chinese regime in fact never officially notified the organization about the Wuhan outbreak. Nor did it provide the WHO with relevant information in the early stages of the epidemic. Both points are in violation of the WHO's international health regulations. That's after one study found that about 95% of virus cases could have been prevented if the regime took action sooner. Documents obtained by Canadian network CBC revealed deadly viruses from Canada's National Microbiology Lab were sent to China before Canada's Federal Police Service, or RCMP, began to investigate the lab. The documents found that in March of last year, live Ebola and Henipa viruses were sent to Beijing. The viruses are classified as level 4 pathogens, meaning they're among the deadliest in the world. They were sent from Canada's Winnipeg lab, the only P4 lab with the highest level of biohazard safety clearance in the country. The documents found that an RCMP investigation located the scientists responsible for sending the viruses to Wuhan's Institute of Virology. 3 months later, on July 5th, the RCMP escorted 2 Chinese research scientists and several Chinese students from the lab on suspicions of a policy breach. But Canada's Public Health Agency says the RCMP investigation and the virus shipments were unrelated, adding the samples were strictly for research purposes. Both agencies have since said there's no evidence the virus shipments led to the current pandemic. They say there were no samples of coronavirus sent, but some experts aren't convinced. The documents confirm that 2 vials, each of 15 strains of virus, were sent to China. They also confirmed that the lab's shipper almost sent the viruses in inappropriate packaging, but corrected it after the Chinese clients caught the problem. The documents say the package was shipped on a commercial Air Canada flight from Winnipeg to Beijing via Toronto on March 31, 2019. It arrived at the Wuhan lab the next day. The head of Canada's Public Health Agency says the investigation is ongoing. According to a new study conducted by the Alliance for American Manufacturing, or AAM, the Chinese Communist Party may view the current global economic crisis as a chance to expand its position in U.S. markets, supply chains, and critical infrastructure. The report warns U.S. lawmakers to be cautious of China's moves to target vulnerable American assets and expand its market share. It also described how Beijing used a similar tactic during the 2003 global financial crisis, and how the Chinese regime positioned itself to benefit from increased U.S. infrastructure spending. AAM is currently working with lawmakers to safeguard funds that were reserved for U.S. companies. The alliance is trying to ensure that the money doesn't wind up in the hands of Chinese state-owned firms or investors. Chinese investors are already subjected to strict inspection, an effort to determine their possible impacts on national security. According to the AAM, now they should face even firmer treatment. That's because foreign takeovers could increase if the pandemic left as many distressed assets as expected. China's social media giant just bought a piece of Warner Music, an important move for its overseas expansion. But this company has a track record of facilitating Beijing surveillance. NTD's Juliet Song reports.
A Chinese tech giant under the thumb of the Chinese Communist regime now owns a piece of Warner Music. This June, China's Tencent bought an almost 2% stake in the world's third largest music company, Warner Music Group. While it doesn't look like a big piece of the pie, the move is still significant for the overseas expansion of the Chinese internet conglomerate. With the deal, it now owns minority stakes in two of the world's three biggest record labels. Just 3 months ago, Tencent bought 10% of the world's largest music company, Universal Music Group. The company has the option to increase the stake to as much as 20%. Universal is home to big names such as Taylor Swift and Justin Bieber. Aside from record labels, Tencent also owns 9% of Spotify, the music streaming giant. But Tencent is also a company that has a track record of helping the ruling party to spy on its own people. It owns China's largest social network, WeChat. The platform boasts over 1 billion monthly active users around the world. The app's soaring popularity gives the company a treasure trove of data to which Chinese authorities have access to, including deleted messages. Under the Chinese law, internet companies have to hand over user data if regime officials want it. Also, in big internet companies like Tencent, China's authorities have stationed web police, whose job it is to crack down on information the regime deems harmful. The state calls these rumors. One such example is whistleblower Dr. Li Wenliang. Last December, before China's authorities admitted the existence of the CCP virus, he warned his colleagues about it in a WeChat group. 4 days later, he ended up in a local police station. He was reprimanded for spreading false rumors on the internet. Li later caught the virus himself and died 4 months before his son was born. Aside from a trip to the police station, WeChat posts can also lead to other consequences. In 2016, a Chinese activist was sentenced to 19 years in prison. His crime was 69 WeChat posts and 205 Twitter posts critical of state policies. For the app's overseas users, politically sensitive posts may not land you in a Chinese jail, but the messages on the platform don't escape Beijing's eye. This May, a Canadian security research group found communications between WeChat's overseas users are subject to the same pervasive content surveillance. Because of the app's popularity among overseas Chinese, many Western politicians opened accounts on the platform to engage their Chinese immigrant constituents. In 2017, Jenny Kwan, a Canadian Parliament member, posted a statement on her WeChat. In the post, she praised the young pro-democracy Hong Kong protesters, saying they stood up and fought for what they believe in and for the betterment of their society. WeChat quietly took down the statement. Last year, a BBC reporter posted photos of Hong Kong's Tiananmen Square anniversary vigil on WeChat. His account was later suspended for spreading malicious rumors. He was able to regain his account after the app scanned his face and collected his voice. In a previous statement, Tencent said content shared among international users of WeChat is private and that their policies and procedures comply with all laws and regulations in each country in which they operate. Reporting by Juliet Song, NTD News.
Already challenged by a long economic slowdown in the U.S.-China trade war, China's job market is seeing yet another blow as the pandemic devastates the economy's bread and butter.
Chinese Premier Li Keqiang revealed that the jobs of nearly 200 million Chinese people rely on companies doing import and export. With a labor force of around 775 million people, the new data suggests that over a quarter of all jobs in China depend on foreign trade. The pandemic has forced factories in China to halt production, and the widespread closure of businesses in Western countries has caused orders from Chinese factories to drastically fall. Experts from various financial institutions have predicted that China will suffer job loss of around 20 to 30% this year, nearly 4 times the new unemployment numbers the Chinese government released this week.
And in other news, the FDA is warning Americans that while their pets don't spread the CCP virus, infected people can give it to their pets. Some house cats, as well as big cats in zoos, have been found to test positive.
In a video posted online, the FDA says that cats and ferrets are the most susceptible pets to the virus, but dogs can catch it too. In the video, the FDA also recommends avoiding dog parks for the time being. The 6-foot social distancing rule is recommended for leashed animals as well. The Food and Drug Administration suggests that if you get sick with the virus, you might consider getting a pet sitter if possible. The CDC says the number of infected cats and dogs has been low, but that they like to keep it that way.
And thrift stores join nationwide reopenings. Donors are lining up to give things away after months of stay-at-home orders gave them the rare extra time needed to clean and declutter their homes.
Goodwill and Salvation Army thrift stores are reopening after months of closures. Just at the same time, many are emerging from their homes and relaxing self-isolation practices. The result? Lines of traffic are constant outside the store's donation centers. Some donors are waiting in line for up to 40 minutes to drop off their items.
So, of course, we're in the time of spring cleaning, and everyone who was sitting home for over 2 months was looking at the items and saying, I don't need this anymore.
That's what brought Howard Cohen to the Goodwill Industries Donation Center in Skokie, Illinois. He says he spent the last few months cleaning out his closets, garage, and other areas around his house.
Staying home inspired me to be more productive at the house, to actually help clean and, get rid of things that I wasn't using that were just taking up space.
Once received, donated items will first be marked with the date they were dropped off. Then they're stored separately for 3 days in order for any bacteria on the surface to die. In the meantime, the items are cleaned and sanitized. The months-long store closures cost the Salvation Army around $15 million in their Midwest locations alone. The organization says it doesn't know how long it will take to recoup, but that stores are seeing a huge influx of donations, and shoppers are coming out to support the mission.
The Commerce Department's May sales report is encouraging. Although it was strong overall, sales are still 8% below where they were in February. Here's a look at some of the highlights.
May's sales boom owes a lot to the automotive sector. It rose by over $30 billion from April and accounts for over 40% of the overall sales increase. Americans also spent more money on their homes. Sales at home and garden centers surged to a record high last month. They're one of just 3 major retail categories, up from a year earlier, along with grocery stores and online retailers. Sales at restaurants and bars shot up nearly 30%, but that only brought the sector back to where it was a decade ago. Clothing retailers increased the most in May, a stunning 188%, but sales are still at just a third of February's level.
As businesses reopen, they're facing a new situation, getting sued for someone catching the virus. Some businesses are using waivers for protection from liability, but workers' groups say it isn't fair on employees.
Many U.S. businesses are asking customers and employees to sign forms saying they won't sue if they get the virus. The liabilities waivers protect businesses in states that don't have any liability limits or immunity from virus-related lawsuits. At least 5 states already have these limits, and more are considering them. But critics say the waivers would allow corporations to skirt safety protocols, and workers' rights groups say the forms force employees to sign away their rights if they get sick. However, in many states, workers risk losing unemployment benefits if they refuse to go back to work because they won't sign.
Here at China in Focus, we dedicate ourselves to bringing you truthful, unbiased reporting. Don't forget to like and subscribe for the latest updates, and see you tomorrow.